We're live. We're joined this hour by Dr. Stephen Alvarez, who is a poet, a professor, an author, a scholar, a traveling um, warrior, road. I'm just combining words at this point.
Yeah.
Very, very excited to have him. Hope he gets back on screen sooner so that I can stop talking. Yes, Dr.
I'm
Stephen
back.
Alvarez. So I want to start this story at the beginning. I want to talk about how you got involved in the wide world of writing and maybe a little bit about your academic journey. Before we do that, though, can you open us up with a poem?
Yeah, well, the reason I was off screen, I was like, oh man, I didn't have a poem. I usually always have a poem, so I had to go grab a couple of books here. And this is a chapbook I published. It's actually through a Canadian publisher. It's called Undocumented Kentucky. And it's kind of ethnographic poems that were about, well, about being Latinx in Kentucky, where there's a significant Latino population, one of the fastest growing Latino populations in the country. And this poem is called Leviathan Spear. Subject called Leviathan Spear. Now, why are we doing this? Because I have seen this spirit on the borderlands, so many people's lives, and I am just really feel from the Lord that I should teach it, this spirit, what it ever does other. Things I'm convinced it's a cause, a divorce, tribal wars, church, let's family feud, sibling rivalries, ministries breaking up. It is more responsible, I believed, in any other sphere if you have your bloodline. Any Mex blood, for instance? I'm not Mexican. Where should the server cracking down, many down, but you might want to renounce and repent for their generational make pretty if you are from Mexis. And he you might have browns, just letting my bleed. Those who never asked any lead. Anyway, you need to repent for this before you begin to deal with this fear because it'll be active in your Kentuck bloodline. We know that someone's alive and can operate in an Apalachicano if it has not meant but dealt with an empty as a territory, a spirit from an doing. Leviathan Spear.
Yeah, no, that's beautiful. So, hey, so this is interesting. I mean, I want to get into your backstory. But before we do that, what inspired that poem?
Well, my first job after graduate school was at University of Kentucky. So I lived in Kentucky for a while, and actually one of my another book, an academic book, is about some of my time there working with after school programs and with the growing Mexican population, majority Mexican, but also folks from Central America and significant folks in the Caribbean. At any rate, the horse industry. And I got to know a lot of folks in the horse industry. And I was interviewing people from my other projects, but then some other stories were just emerging. And more or less, I was trying to combine some ethno-poetic forms, working on kind of documentary poetics. And the book itself was really thinking about a kind of undocumentary of folks in Kentucky. So it's sort of trying to put a historical cultural lens on what I saw as a migration issue in the bluegrass, and also tying it in with some of the larger racial dynamics that have historically been a part of Kentucky's history, including the indigenous history as well.
Yeah. Oh man, I'm really gonna love digging into some of this stuff. I mean, so this is really fascinating me, kind of the changing demographics in areas that people don't normally expect to see it, or we don't people really don't think about it. So I'm gonna
For
really,
sure.
I'm really looking forward to talking more about your work. But before we do that, I want to get in the background. I want to get to the beginning. Stephen, can you tell us a little about your educational journey, how how you began, where your life begins, and where it takes you?
Oof, all right. Well, how long we got? Just kidding. uh, well, I'm born in
Go
Safford,
ahead.
Arizona. Safford is Safford. I always got to spell it out because it sounds like I say Stafford or Samford, but it's Safford, and it sucks. It's pretty shitty. Maybe less than 10,000 people, and hopefully nobody from Safford's watching that and they're like, "Oh man, why y'all can be hating on Safford?" I mean, that's where I'm from, and it's rural Arizona, southeast Arizona, known for what's called the three C's, which are copper, cattle, and cotton. Come from a family of copper miners. My father's father was from Sinaloa, a little pueblito called Tetaroba, and then closer to a city El Fuerte. And then he migrated during the Mexican Revolution. Um, the way he said was, "If I stay, I die. Either I get killed by the Federales if I don't join them, or I get killed by Pancho Villa if I don't join them." So vamos al norte. So he ended up in a place called Cananea, also significant. place for a Mexican Revolution. Another big copper mine found its way north, and then eventually, my mother's family actually came from Cananea. My mother was born in Cananea, which is another border town of Sonora, big copper mine. Uh, Eventually, my family migrated to Safford because of the 1980s recession, and copper mines closed down in a place called Bisbee where my family lived. So they migrated to another copper mine. Well, anyway, so I'm giving this larger social history because I grew up working class and my family was always following labor, principally industry and the copper industry. And it dictated large parts of their lives, including my upbringing. And I came to understand this later. So went to a public school my whole life, did really well. So I got a scholarship to go to University of Arizona. My parents, my father was a copper miner. When he retired, he became a custodian. My mom was always a custodian. So my parents were always custodians. So as long as I remember, I used to go to work with them and clean offices and movie theaters, people's houses, white people's houses. I should point out, and all this stuff for me when I went to college had an effect where when I started reading stuff like Marxism, it opened up different ways of thinking about my class positionality and my consciousness and my own identity. In addition to that, my own Mexican identity became to the fore because I started really understanding what it's like to, you know, grow up in Arizona. Let me just put it this way: you grew up in Arizona, you were taught to hate yourself, and that's an experience that my father experienced growing up, that I experienced, and I still see it happening now with the current generations of younger folks in Arizona. Talk about a dry heat; it's a drier hate. But anyway, so went to University of Arizona. First one in my family to go to college. I got there because of scholarships because my parents never would have been able to pay. um, Life changing ways of thinking about reading, discovering myself as a writer, and all the stuff I was trying to write I felt was bold and experimental, but some of my poet teachers didn't like it, more or less discouraged me. I kept writing. Eventually, got my idea to go to grad school. Went to New York City for grad school, my PhD. In New York, I met some Mexican folks, mostly Poblanos, who live in New York. Like Kentucky, a sort of more recent wave of migration since about the mid 90s, maybe early 90s, late mid 80s or so. And that's where my dissertation was about Mexicans in New York and literacy. And anyway, so in the meantime, while I'm doing all this work, I kept doing my writing because even though I was discouraged for writing weird ass poetry and fiction, I still kept doing it. And the stuff that I'm currently writing now is stuff that I wrote when I was probably in my 20s. I'm 40 now. So it's a lot of stuff that I wrote that just never found any kind of audience. And I see that as the further I've moved in my education, it's more a lot of me reflecting on my upbringing in Safford and all those historical circumstances and trying to discover through an art form, poetry especially, that is politically um, committed while also open to experimentation and play with form. And I think that's an old kind of combination that artists have been struggling with for a long time. So that's kind of where I see myself as a writer. Where it goes, I would say that I'm more interested in speculative work. I'm trying to think about speculative poetry, and so I'm starting to do some stuff that thinks about climate change and migration, uh, policing, and then hopefully maybe now I'm starting to think more about what it means to live in this current sort of uh, pandemic situation and what that looks like. So anyway, just been a lot of work, and I feel like through writing, especially, and a lot of reading, it kind of liberated me from a very secluded upbringing where I got to see a lot more of the world and got to have the good fortune of living all kinds of places and meeting all kinds of cool people.
Yeah. So, can you tell us a little bit? I mean, I was just taking notes of some of the things you talked about. Can you talk about the historic significance of Cananea?
I mean, Cananea, arguably, some folks will say that's where the Mexican Revolution began.
Yeah.
In copper mines there, as in southern Arizona, these are open pit mines, so it's literally outright mountain removal to dig giant pits to basically try to just extract the ore. Now you can imagine most of these during the Porfiriato, it was basically open season for international corporation investment for pure extraction. So these were American corporations on the border who also brought in American workers. So there was a dual wage system. So you can imagine who got paid more and who got paid less, and how that built feelings of resentment among Mexicans who saw foreigners earning a higher wage in Mexico with better jobs. So that was a hotbed of labor activism. And it was also a place where some of the first violence of the revolution, which is a popular uprising, began. So, copper mines, by the way, in Bisbee, also in Cananea, in Morenci, all anywhere where there was a copper mine, and also in places like Montana, everywhere. These were always hotbeds of the Wobblies, of folks who were involved in labor rights, labor activism. So they were also sites of extreme violence and repression by the state. So learning some of that history, and then going to, for my own example, studying my family history and seeing where labor history intersected with family history gave me a better idea of our social identity, and connected that with migration aspects of race. Helped me really start to thinking of a sociology of my family history when I think of it this way. And that's been really significant for me because it also gets me to think that while we might think that our own individual identities are unique, we also have social identities which position us in commonalities and groupings. So to understand how my story was a lot like other people's story was liberating, because I saw that there was a shared oppression. And sometimes when it's individualized, we don't see that oppression, we internalize that as our own moral failure. But when we see that this oppression is common, and we find that there's also common ground for potential liberation as well.
Can you talk about the historic significance of Bisbee?
Bisbee, almost the same story. I mean, except, I think Cananea is maybe about 12 miles, 15 miles south of the border, and Bisbee is about 50 miles north of the border, but very similar. Again, open pit mine, a couple open pit mines. And these were a little bit different, though, because these mines were owned by companies in New York, Phelps Dodge, and some of these other companies. So there was the resentment that this time was happening. The popular uprising were geared more towards the metropolitan centers on the East Coast and some other robber barons and the like. But there was still there in Bisbee a lot of labor activism. There's a pretty important historical event in 1917. Actually, this affected my father's family, where Mexican people, Mexican American, were loaded onto train cars during a labor strike and shipped to New Mexico, not Mexico, but to the White Sands in New Mexico, and just basically left there, ostensibly either to just find their way back home, starve, or just a sense of extrajudicial exile. So this was they were deputized. White folks were deputized in order to round up people in the early mornings and put them on the trains. So my father's uncle was involved in this, and he eventually found his way back. I mean, a lot of people did. Walked a long way back, but Bisbee then was always a place where there was the resurgence of labor and then repression by the state. So up to the point in the 1970s, when my family lived there, my father lived there, he would tell me in his own history. I did the oral history of my father about the recurrence of strike negotiations, world markets fluctuating, especially the price of copper plummeting because of production in Chile. Well, all this goes to say is that when the Bisbee mine closed down, that was at the point where we started to see that the state and Reaganomics were really coming together to really just eliminate unions altogether. And so that was a movement that I saw that was happening for my father's generation of labor, but it's still something that I see now happening in terms of the reduction of unions. So Bisbee is an important place to think about deindustrialization and what that looks like, and then how, especially for the labor union, when it becomes scattered and this way kind of disintegrated.
Yeah, yeah. So, it's your story. I mean, I thank you for that, by the way. Both Cananea, I made reference to it in the poem Pilgrim. Say from
Mm,
Cananea Strike to Delano, from Cananea Mine to Delano Strike, and then Bisbee. I make Bisbee something something Porvenir, the Blood, Sweat, and Tears. So these two places and these historic incidents actually found their way into my own work. So when you said
mm,
those two things, it was very interesting because you're talking about Stafford, a place people might have, I'm not that familiar with. Most people aren't, but many people may not be. But then you say these other two places, so it's very interesting that even though you come from a place that might be remote, your family history takes you to places that carry very large significance in the history
oh,
of
sure.
both Mexico and its relationship to the United States. You know,
Sure. I mean, I'll put it this way. Stafford has its significance too, particularly for the Apache Wars. And also, that was before the Gadsden Purchase. That's where the border was, the Gila River. That crosses right through the middle of Stafford. And I'll put it this way, that every place has its history. and you just got to find what that history is. There is also a history about how my family left Bisbee to go to Safford to work in Morenci mines, and how that was a big movement in 1983 during, that was when the air traffic controllers were eliminated by Reagan, and basically Bruce Babbitt sent in a National Guard to take down strikers in Morenci. I mean, it was there's so much history everywhere, and for me to grow up in a place like Safford where I just thought, who the hell cares? Who gives a damn about this place? And then to start doing that history and seeing that there is a rich history there, and there's a rich history that is, it's a sad history that is Mexican. And I say this with regards to the Apache folks because uh, these were the folks who were the true warriors of the Southwest and who were persecuted by Spaniards, by Mexicans, by Texans, by Americans, continue by American empire and settler colonialism. So I think there was for me, I think reading history especially opened up a worldview to start thinking about a larger social picture. And that was, again, part of this kind of a consciousness that connected me to, as you pointed out, even your own work, this kind of a social consciousness for liberation.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. So your early days begin in Arizona. You get an education. One of the reoccurring themes that has come up in many of these interviews is this kind of an education system where our community are oftentimes given a substandard education because we're kind of designated for jobs with substandard wages, right? Not to say that it's substandard labor, but they're substandard wages, and so we're kind of destined for that. So anytime you show like proficiency in academia and in these official veins of rewarded intelligence, so to speak, you get punished as a Mexican person. So oftentimes by the school system. So the question I have for you is like, when was the first time that larger society punished you for being a smart Mexican?
Well, man, that's like probably the question: when was the most recent time? Because,
Why don't the time the earliest you can recall, and then the most recent.
well, no, I mean, if I go back, I think I've had kind of a different relationship to education, I would say, than my father's generation. And I did some interviews of my folks, particularly my mom and my dad. My dad was young, grew up in Bisbee, and the teachers used to hit him, for speaking Spanish, and would make him stand behind a classroom door and stuff. I mean, just some really sadistic, sadistic shit, really, for no other reason than just being like, I don't know, just having a hateful heart, which is not the reason why you should get an education. Number one, right? So in my own experience, I think I just kind of had a good fortune of like good and bad fortune. I think probably, and this doesn't really answer your question per se because it's a little bit different, maybe. I'm Mexican American, but I grew up among a lot of white folks. In my neighborhood, we were the only Mexican family among a bunch of Mormon families, Mormon folks, white folks. Ostracized whiteism, whiteness to a degree. That is, Mormon folks are considered, they're white, but they're like a different kind of white tied to religion. So I grew up with a lot of them, and I spoke English like the Mormon kids, but I wasn't like them. And then there was Mexican kids who lived across the way in a place called Vista Linda, where we had a lot of friends, but my family lived among the Mormons. So I wasn't like the Mexican kids either. So I always felt like this really weird in between where I was this high performing, high achieving brown kid, but I wasn't like the white kid because they still had their preconception that if you're brown, you're supposed to be something else and you're not supposed to be like in the smart classes unless you're like affirmative action or something like that, right? Anyway, so I think the part that really got me though was growing up and not having as strong as a command of Spanish as some of my cousins. And when I felt that sometimes I knew I was really smart, I felt it most when it came to my Mexican identity. And that's where Arizona did a really big number on trying to erase that. And when I felt the least intelligent was when I tried to had to feel that I had to defend myself on my Mexican identity, mostly among other Mexicanos, right? So that's a little bit of a reverse. To bring it back to my more recent stuff, though, I mean, I have a PhD, and whatever else, that's not always a shield, man. You know what I mean? I mean, it's like I've been in a situation where uh, no, I have a PhD, and whatever else, they just assume like, oh, you work here, or like, you got keys. Can you help me open the door so I can find a professor, for example? Or people. who I work with who don't always respect the kind of work that I do. It just goes down the line, and there are constant reaffirmations that they reaffirm that people like you are supposed to be parts of these institutions. But once we're in these institutions, then it becomes our duty uh, to make them work for us, and also to keep that in mind about the future ones coming in. That is the future youngsters coming in. So a lot of my work actually is my research is in literacy, literacy with a Freudian frame of mind, to really think about literacy and liberation, particularly for Latinx young folks. So that all goes to say that I feel like through poetry, through thinking about history, through artwork, there's a shared way where we can think about liberation for empowerment for young folks, but a kind of transformative empowerment, not empowerment that gets used by like nonprofits and that kind of group, but really a kind of way of finding the power through transformation, which is also a way of a critical consciousness. So this all goes to say that growing up in Arizona and even through some of my schools, I was kind of taught to hate myself, not to be proud of myself, not to even think that I was even worth a goddamn or even anything else. And then it took a lot of unpacking in higher education, decolonize that education that really got me to see myself in dehumanized terms. So for my larger project, my own research, I always try to make sure, especially when working with young people, to let them know they're smart, you matter, you're important, you are a part of something bigger. Your story is a part of your family's story and a larger tradition of other families like yours. And I think that for me has been very liberating, and that's something I try to impart to the other folks as well.
Yeah. So a lot of your work, your dissertation, your first book, a lot of it's about kind of it's about Mexicans in New York. The more recent work is about Mexicans in like places like Kentucky, like you were talking about, and various other places where we don't expect to see Mexicans. So I'm kind of curious as to I mean, I want to talk about the significance of that, and the broader significance, and what that means, right, for these populations to be moving in areas that traditionally have not been found. And what does it mean for the country? What does it mean for the whole national politics? But before we get into that, I want to ask you, why do you do that?
Sorry, what was the last part? Why did I what?
Why do you do it? Like, why are you writing about
Oh,
Mexicans in Kentucky, Mexicans in New
oh.
York? Yeah,
I was like, I thought you said, why did I leave? And I'm like, well, no. Why did I do? I mean, part of it was it's where I found myself. Um, when I was in New York, I was working on my PhD. So I lived in New York for 7 years. And when I realized I could leave my little town of Safford, I went to University of Arizona. And then for one summer, I got to go. First time I was in an airplane, 22 years old, I did a summer abroad trip for like 8 weeks in England. So it was the first time I ever took a plane, and I went to England for a summer because I wanted to go see where John Milton lived. It was in Cambridge. I wanted to go walk around there and see like all the stuff I had read. I just wanted to read about it. Notice I had only read about white folks because I probably should have did that like in Latin America, but I wasn't there yet. Anyway, um, so I found myself in New York, and in New York, I was my PhD studies initially. I wanted to study James Joyce and Sam Beckett and Ezra Pound. But I really thought about quitting grad school because I thought it's not for people like me. Um, I have one distinct memory where sometimes after the grad seminar, grad students would go out to nearby bars and kind of hang out and talk, whatever. And I don't know why this conversation came up, but one day people were like, "Let's go around the table and say what our parents do." And I'm like, "Oh shit!" So it's like people are like doctor, lawyer, all these professionals. He came to me, and I'm like, "Yeah, my parents are janitors." They're like, "Yeah, no, Steve, come on, seriously, what do your parents do?" I'm like, "Yeah, they're fucking janitors. I'm proud of it." You see what I'm saying? And it's like, I knew this academia thing was not for people like me, and that I was going to write this dissertation about these three dead white dudes that's not going to have any applicability to people like me. And so much so that the people I love most, like my parents, weren't even going to be able to understand what the hell I was writing. So I thought, I don't know if I want to do this. But the one thing I really loved, though, was teaching. I was teaching like first year writing. And I think it was the working with students and working with writing that was kind of keeping me in. At any rate, I met this guy on the subway one morning, and he gave me his business card and says, "We have this after school program. It's mostly Mexicans in New York. Come help out." So I went out, and that became my dissertation because I was helping Poblanos. And I didn't really know much about Poblanos. I didn't know why Poblanos came to New York. And I started studying a little bit more about the indigeneity in Mexico because where I'm from, in Sonora, you're more likely to find folks called Güero, right? But southern Mexico, it's a little bit different. So there's a long historical well, not to go into the history, but we can say that there's more people of indigenous background in Mexico per density. And those are some of the folks who are coming from Oaxaca, Guerrero, the Mixtec region of southern Mexico, and they're coming to New York. So I got to learn a little bit more about that migration. Moved to Kentucky because I got a job at University of Kentucky, and I met more Mexicans who were arriving there around the same time, post NAFTA, same thing with New York as well. So by virtue of where I was, I wanted to connect with gente. That was the first thing. And then when I got to know the gente, we got to develop bonds of trust, confianza, and begin to work. We start thinking about building alliances, and by virtue of being a Mexican American, I did develop some kinds of rapport, although it's not the same. You know what I'm saying? It's not the same. Put it this way: to be um, Texas Mexican or Tex-Mex is a long-established identity. Cal-Mex too, however complicated that is. Be Kentucky Mex, that's only been around for maybe a generation and a half. That's a new identity, and that's an emerging identity. To be New York Mexican also is a new emerging kind of Mexican identity. So these are all very interesting to me because I got to see that what's it like to be able to speak English with an Appalachian accent, speak Spanish like you're from Jalisco, which is a very interesting dynamic for people in Kentucky that I got to encounter. I had a good fortune. So, the longer question was I was doing research, and the research I do is always with communities and thinking about the communities I belong to. And that's kind of as I travel, that's involved in different places.
Yeah, I had the fortune of speaking at the University of Wisconsin,
Mm,
doing this doing some poetry, but also delivering kind of this keynote speech
nice.
called "Taco Trucks on Every Corner," um, and it basically covered like like look, this whole thing, the whole thing that animates the Trump campaign is a sphere of demographic shift, and I cited examples of all these speeches at the RNC just as evidence of this, right, and just things that
Mm,
we're saying in the lead up to that. But the speech concluded, so like Wisconsinites, I want to let you know, like like everywhere the taco truck goes, it embraces the culture around it, So
mm.
like fear not, fear not. You're not losing your cheese curds. You're gaining a tortilla, right? That's
I like that.
that's
There you
kind of
go.
that was
Yeah.
kind of speech, but it's very similar to what you're describing. Can you tell us though? I'm interested. This is something I just dabbled in, and something I made up for one speech, and it's just something I was an interloper in this world of taco politics. Can you talk to us a little bit about taco literacy?
Sure. Well, I mean, it's kind of what you just said. I like how you put that everywhere the taco truck goes, it welcomes. That's pretty much true. Tacos in general, but I guess the turn to foodways, has been a more recent turn in my research because it was still thinking about Mexican people, but then about the kind of expressions that are historicized, but they're also very political. In one way, the way you describe in the politics of the United States, but also Mexican food, as anywhere else, is political in Mexico, in terms of like the dynamics between, let's say, you can see this between, let's say, the flour tortilla versus a corn tortilla, and where people fall on that divide. In Mexico, it's even more complicated because the Spaniards literally tried to just destroy all land races of corn, partly because to destroy people meant also to destroy their diet, and also because corn was sacred in terms of cosmovision and the centrality of a mythic cosmovision of the people of Mesoamerica and all throughout the Americas. So, for taco literacy, the class is really thinking about how we can read food, how we can read food socially, historically, politically, and ways that you can do this not just with taco, but just Mexican food in general. So Mexican food broadly, thinking about Mexican food in Mexico as it migrates to the United States and all the regional varieties of Mexico and all the regional varieties when they come to the United States, what that means over time. And I'd say the larger issue, the big feature, the thing I try to push students to think most about is that all this stuff with the food is really about the people. And when food becomes decontextualized from people, that's when it's the most dangerous because that's when we forget that those vegetables had human hands that harvested them, people who are exploited on that. I mean, you think about these folks in meat working plants right now and the situation about what it means to be an essential worker, but yet at the same time, someone who's being surveilled and told, we don't want you here, but we want your arms. This thing about we want your work, but we just don't want you. And that happens a lot through food. That happens through the labor of food in terms of restaurants. And also, you can think about people doing delivery service right now, but it also is an old recurring theme that happens throughout the history of any kind of quote unquote ethnic food in the United States. So taco literacy for me has been a fun way for me to get students to really start thinking about through the food that we eat some of these larger questions. I mean, I'll put it this way: getting students, let's say majority white students, in the case of Kentucky, to think about migration in humanizing terms is very difficult because of the propaganda that comes from the right wing. That's very difficult to dislodge. It's possible, especially with the younger ones. I was teaching a class called Mexington, Kentucky, where I tried to do that, and it was an uphill battle. Then at the end of that class, I took students to go get tacos at Taqueria, and they had so many questions. They were like, all the menu was in Spanish, and they want to know like what is barbacoa. They want to know what is cabeza. So I had to explain all these things. The tortillas were made there, uh, fresh corn tortillas made with corn. So I explained that, and I realized all this stuff I was trying to do with migration. I could do food in ways that are humanizing, in ways that will get students to really identify through the food with people. So that's the larger issue with taco literacy, is getting to a humanized stance where people can see people through the food, but also appreciate the common humanity, because food is what sustains us, but it's what gives us power. And especially for a community that's been marginalized, to really put it in humanizing perspectives of foodways, it's a tremendous way to think about giving voice.
Yeah. That's quite something. It was interesting. I got a chance to interview Luis Chirea, and he talked about some of the
Oh, yeah.
insults that were heaped his way in youth, and two of them were like pepper belly, which that's kind of old, and taco bender, but obviously the more common one is beaner, right? And it just seems very
Yeah.
interesting that like this thing that Mexican food, along with probably like Italian food and Chinese food, are probably known as like the most popular foods outside of just the people that eat them, right? So like everybody loves Italian, Chinese, Mexican. So like it seems like that becomes this thing that's seen as a positive becomes a negative somehow. It becomes a deficit. Like your food is delicious, fuck you, you're like the idea of like labor is turned against us. You guys are such hard workers. You're idiots, like fuck you, like the um I don't know, it just so many different things. Um, you end up getting turned on us. God, I
Definitely.
remember. Yeah, I had a question that was related to that, but then I just got emotional.
Yeah, it's all right. No, I mean, what you
Thinking about this.
when you think about, I mean, put it the other way too, that there is insults that Mexicans have on white folks too. I think one of bolillo, it's one of my favorites. Like, hey, you roll, you dinner white bread dinner roll. I mean, there's like a larger that happens historically where, for example, in case of Mexican food, that white people are entranced by Mexican food. They like it. They somehow they complain about the spice, but they like it too after a while.
Yeah.
And the question though about, all right, we want the food, but we don't want the people. How can we get the food and just get rid of the people, because the people are dirty, quote
Mm-hmm.
unquote. They're not hygienic, and we want their delicious food. We just don't want them. So we can put beans in cans, because cans are hygienic and they're industrial, and we can make like our own tortillas, and like in other words, how can we industrialize it by getting rid of the Mexican people and historical contributions and become something different that is decontextualized from that history. And that happens, I think, to all American foods. I mean, something like a hamburger or the hot dog, those are German. And
Right, right.
where's in the background all that go? As you become American, you kind of forget that history. But Mexican food is something different because we share the border. They're a nation that was colonized in that sense as well. So understanding that history also means understanding a lot of that history that is shared between the United States and Mexico. But central to that, I think the aspect of corn, especially, is at the heart of Mexican food, and really getting to know some of the indigeneity and aspects of corn are foundational. A lot of this too is also a return to the earth, thinking away from GMOs and sort of I don't know, some of the larger issues of geopolitics with food and trade, and really thinking about returning to the land and indigenous knowledge of foodways. So a decolonial way, I think, is also kind of interesting to think about related to foodways.
Yeah, I think another thing that's is really you mentioned earlier that like they want the labor, but they don't want the people, right? And I think that like that kind of wanting the product of a group of people, but not wanting their full humanity is a condition common to many different groups of people who find themselves in these lower positions. But there's something very particular about the Mexican experience and this hyper exploitation of labor and this
Mhm.
and then get rid of them, and then get them out of here, right? With these mass deportations, my own family got caught up in the Mexican Repatriation Act. My great grandfather was a coal miner in
Mhm.
Colorado, and so
Mhm.
there's this long history of taking the labor and then pushing the people out, and in this kind of you
Mhm.
don't belong here kind of stuff. That's very
Mhm.
interesting because my grandfather was also swept up in the Mexican Repatriation Act. He was born in Colorado, you know.
Mhm.
Um, and I don't know if you mentioned earlier Marxism, and um, if you look at you know the particularities of the aftermath of the Mexican American War, Marx's concept of primitive accumulation actually it transplants almost perfectly onto that. I mean, you're talking about a group of people who at one point in time are landowners or the hacienda thing, or they're just kind of like encomienda. They're kind of like they're small farmers, and then they are proletarianized. They are proletarianized in the most
Mhm.
brutal fashion imaginable, and then they become
Yeah.
a group of laborers who are pushed and pulled in and out of the country. So it's very difficult to establish this is our farmer tenant union when everyone's gonna be deported immediately, right? Everyone's just gone, and you have this long historical trajectory of just throwing people out. So
Mhm.
can you speak to that a little bit, like the particularities of the Mexican American experience with this with this kind of claim to land, and then this hyper extended no, no, you really don't belong here, like you are foreign, the perpetual foreignness of being a Mexican descent within the United States.
Yeah, I mean, what you're describing is outright dispossession, whether that looks like something in terms of gentrification or zoning laws or eminent domain. There's a long history of that happening in terms of barrios in any kind of city. I'm thinking of especially downtown Tucson, thinking about where Dodger Stadium is in LA. I mean, any kind of city where there is valuable real estate, and then how that can be something that's taken. And it's, of course, after 1848, all the claims that were deeds of land were, of course, contested and outright stolen as well. So there's been the history of dispossession, and the technology of dispossession has become um, its own a kind of accumulation, if you think of it that way. And it's outright colonial manifestations that happen in terms of what it looks like as the concentration of wealth. Although it's a concentration of wealth that's, historically, think of it in national terms, it would be like the robber barons of a different kind of generation. The robber barons, I think, probably still exist, except now they are outright emperors. They're the oligarchy. They are the fascists who live and they have national status across different nations. And in fact, they have no allegiance to any kind of nation state. They have allegiance to corporate kind of sense of greed. And usually it's a kind of very structured fascist style of corporatization. So to bring this all back, there's also Mexican players in this. Carlos Slim is among them, for example. Um, and then there's also, I think that it gets really very complicated what it means for people today to think about what it means to have property, and then how property at all different levels is being dispossessed. Now, for Mexican folks, I was just listening to a podcast this morning that was about this ProPublica article describing about Mexican folks here in my neighborhood, Queens, here in close to Jackson Heights, Elmhurst Hospital. I'm hearing sirens and helicopters right now. This has been the epicenter of the epicenter. And what I was hearing about was the people who were working in restaurants right now, who were doing deliveries, and people who are not going to hospitals out of fear and dying at home. There's projected somewhere that around 400 undocumented Mexicans have died from coronavirus, COVID-19, but have not been reported. And the additional complications of this about folks being indigenous Mexican and not being able to perform rites with their family, and also just to be able to get bodies transported back to Mexico, or ashes at least. So when it comes down to this, the dispossession that happens on one hand is that the outright taking, but then the profitability of dispossession is a whole other aspect. And I say this when, for example, detention centers become for profit or privatized. That is, when private property of the individual body becomes a thing that can have wealth extracted, whether that's from our data or whether that's just from the virtue of just being a body that it takes up space that can be given contracts by the federal government per bed, per hour, and so on. You really start to see that this dispossession and the technology behind it is it's powerful, and it's powerful in its any kind of hybrid ways, and it takes different forms historically. Now, for Mexican people, I think as I've seen it, uh, my own studies over time, I've noticed that the recurring pattern is, and it's a pretty common pattern, is that it's the oligarchs. They take different faces over time as well, and some of them have brown faces, some of them don't, and some of them have different color faces. But when it comes down to it, it's like there is a strength that happens among people when they can solidify a movement. But because people are so fractured, it's hard to form a solidified movement. And to feel that something like this digital way of bringing people together might be some kind of manifestation of liberation, I find that hard to believe because it's not putting, let's say, bodies on the streets. However, even at this point right now, we see that putting bodies on the streets is dangerous for all those bodies. And the people who are putting bodies on the streets, well, I don't know. I don't want to talk about them, but I just saw this video the other day about people who are protesting about a gym not opening and they're doing push-ups outside. I'm just like, this is where we go. So anyway, that's a long-winded question or
Yeah.
long-winded answer. Apologies.
No, that's good. Yeah, that's good. In 2015, Donald Trump comes down an escalator and says Mexico is sending drug dealers and rapists, or is he sending drug dealers? He's sending the Mexico's sending drug dealers, they're rapists, and some of them are good people, etc. The story goes on that Donald Trump wins the Republican primary, making Mexico kind of a centerpiece. He goes on to win the general election. Not really, but by electoral college, goes on to win the electoral college, and making Mexico kind of the centerpiece of his presidential campaign. Um, that used to be seen as a way to win the governorship of Arizona, to win the governorship of Texas, to win pockets of California at one point in time, to win the governorship of California. But making Mexicans the centerpiece of your political campaign has not always been the way to win national office, right? At least within our lifetimes.
Yeah.
It seems to me that the politics of the Southwest, which is blaming Mexicans, looking at the Mexican scapegoat, looking at the border, looking at the border threat, all that kind of stuff, that plays big, especially in Arizona, Texas, and again, pockets of New Mexico, pockets of California. Um,
Mm-hmm.
those politics have gone national. They've become the politics of Joe Arpaio have become the national politics. And it would seem to me that a lot of that has to do with the fact that this population has gone national. That we see
Yeah.
growing Mexican populations in Oklahoma City, in Detroit, in all these places that you don't normally see Mexicans. And your work
Mm-hmm.
seems to really touch on that. Like, so can you speak a little bit to like um, to what the future portends? Because in my mind, there's going to be more Trumps. It's not this one guy. I mean, this question of like Mexicans are taking over. That politics isn't going anywhere.
Yeah, no, you're great. Everything you said is right on. I think you point on a few things. One is that I tell this to people all the time that this I don't know, this Trump figure, he's nothing new to me. I was like, yeah, we lived from Arizona. Thing is now the whole country is Arizona. The whole world is Arizona. As shitty as that is, in terms of being anti-migrant or the fear that they're coming to take things over, or they're coming to rob us of entitlements, or they're destroying our schools, our national culture, and so on. Anyway, I grew up with that. And that's also something growing up that internalized in me a kind of hate for myself and for people like me, which is also very problematic, especially for youth of color to feel like you turn yourself against your family. Like you got to turn yourself against where you come from in order to be able to succeed. And what that means in terms for how you see yourself. And then what that means now on a national scale for young kids or young people of color to feel that they have to, I don't know, disidentify with their roots. Some of them, not all of them. Although I would say, you think about like the Republican convention when Trump was up there were two Latino candidates. If you want to call them Latino, Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio, little Marco, uh, but they're on the wrong side. You know what I'm saying? I mean, we had Julian Castro. That's something. I think that's something significant for us. But I'll put it this way: uh, California, Arizona, Chicago, Texas, they have a long checkered history, just like you said. There's been a lot of wins, there's been a lot of losses. Places like Kentucky, places like New York, North Carolina, Georgia, they can look to those histories and they can look for what works, but also what hasn't worked as a way as an opportunity to move things forward. And I'll give Kentucky some credit. Uh, in Kentucky, where I was doing some research in Lexington, where University of Kentucky is, there's a barrio called Mexington. Guess who lives there? Really good Mexican food, by the way. In Mexington, though, there is a bilingual public library. I always got to say this again, make sure I emphasize the point. It's bilingual public library. There's no bilingual public libraries in Texas. I mean, when I say public library, I mean it's run by city government, and it's not bilingual. That means like here's all the English books and a shitty little Spanish section over here. All the books are shelved next to each other, and the majority of the books are in Spanish. So that's become a place where you can see that having a space like that that's recognized by a city government that says you matter and we've thought about you and we have this for you is something that is significant. It's something that other places can learn from, including places like I mentioned before, Chicago, LA, all those other places. So the stories, they change over time, but they come from the xenophobia, which is larger. And xenophobia is something that's not just relegated to the United States. This is a larger issue that's happening across the globe.
Yeah, yeah. I definitely agree with that, and we definitely see a right wing move. In all kinds of places. I mean, even places. I mean, like, in the United States, all that stuff is it's so deeply tied to white supremacy that you can't really
Definitely.
you can't you can't straighten it out. But we see a right wing move in India. We see a right wing move in the Philippines. We see a right wing move in
Mm-hmm.
Turkey. Right wing moves all over the place where people we would not identify as white in the United States of America, just totally
Right.
independent of just based upon the own histories of those countries, right? Um,
Yeah.
yeah. So, but within the context of the United States, it's interesting to me that all these things are happening because like when you described in Kentucky, that may seem surprising to a lot of people, but that's not surprising me at all. Like there'd be more acceptance and more whatever in Kentucky, which might be seen as more racist than anywhere else, or blah blah, et cetera, than in other places. But there'd be more racism against Mexicans in Colorado. That's not surprising me at all, because
Yeah.
there's historic antagonism against Mexicans in Colorado that isn't as deeply rooted in Kentucky. So I mean, or isn't as deeply rooted in these places. So as our population expands in these places, that we're not at one point. Oh, and you are back. You're back.
Sorry.
As,
I don't know.
as our
Somebody
population
gave me a call. It's my
Okay.
fault.
As our population expands into places that have not historically been Mexico, right? I mean that don't have a history of the Mexican American War. They don't have like 100 years of history of blaming
Yeah.
Mexicans. Um,
Yeah.
Certainly, we see the reactionary politics being expanded there, but it's not quite the same,
You're
right?
right.
So
Well,
what
no,
we
it's,
hope to work
it's
in?
kind of a little bit more complicated too, because on one hand, well, on the activist side, I'd say there's a lot of faith-based activism in Kentucky, and that's been probably where, in terms of migration politics, where you see more kind of intersectional politics happening in terms of white folks who are, I guess you would say, they're kind of like the social Christian form of like kind of like a Cornell West kind of Christian, I guess, activism. But then probably the larger picture, and this is where Latinos, let's say in DC, and I think also Chicago, uh, function in a similar kind of social way as a kind of brown buffer zone between white and black relations. So it's usually where, in the case of Chicago, where it's still highly segregated, but there's a kind of Mexican middle ground that is supposed to be like an additional buffer or wall between black folks and white folks. So the historic racial dynamics between black and white, particularly in the South, are disrupted because there's a growing brown population, but there's also a growing Asian population. So sometimes it's kind of like the anti-blackness is still very much affirmed, and this is where it gets especially complicated for Mexican folks. And this is kind of the false choice that Italian folks were given, and I think the Irish folks too. That we don't like you, we're going to exclude you, you're going to be marginalized. We want you for your labor, we don't want you. However, after a course of generations, okay, yeah, you speak English now, and you still have some connections to your family, food, or some issues of language, but we'll let you join us as long as you become anti-black. And now you're welcome to the club. So when I mentioned Marco Rubio before, Ted Cruz, I mean, this is like an option of like, yeah, you can be one of the majority if you become anti-black and play onto that question of white supremacy. And there are plenty of Mexican folks who will play onto that and who have played on that and who have capitalized on that as well. And that aspect of phenotype, I think, is something that's going to divide a lot of gente, and it's also going to be something to be reckoned with. So that's going to be, I think, is a future way to think about. But in terms of race, in the South, whiteness is complicated, but it's always predicated on anti-blackness.
Yeah, yeah. No, it seems like Jeb Bush made that play, right? That Jeb Bush was running all kinds of he's running kind of a bilingual campaign actually at a certain point in time.
Mm,
And he was kind of seen as the heading into the 2016 election. As early as 2013, you heard it was going to be Hillary Clinton versus Jeb Bush. It was kind of like preordained, um,
yeah.
preordained what do you call it, general election. Um,
Mm, sorry
and,
about that.
and I think that in many ways Jeb Bush um, was banking on this question, the whitening of Hispanics, right? That sort of thing. That the expansion of whiteness to include the quote unquote Hispanic population, right? Including his own son, whose own father referred to as the little brown one, right? But then you had Donald Trump enter the race and be like, no, those people aren't white, and then and here we are.
Yeah, here we are. It's like, whatever happened to Jeb too? He's been where is Jeb? I haven't seen that heard from that guy in a long time.
He took a shellacking. I mean, he was supposed to be the guy, and it didn't
Yeah.
work out. So,
Mm.
I really appreciate the time that you spent with us. Can you share with us another poem?
Sure, man. Let me go through here really quick. Let me see if I can find a good one. So, yeah, I'll try this one here. So this comes from well, this is from a chapbook. This one is another one called Six Poems from the Codex Mahauticus. And the Codex Mahauticus is another book. You like it? It's on Fence, published it. And this is the first poem I ever read in public. I won a contest in New York City where it had to be a poem about Times Square. And I wrote this poem about this character named Charlie Chastateas. And he's dumping his Theo's ashes, who just passed away, in Times Square. So I got picked. I won this poem, and I got to read my poem in the middle of Times Square. It was the first time I ever read in public. So I'm going to read this poem. It's called 2007 Fifth Sun, Our President. And so Theo, Pancho, and Charlie penetrated Manhattan, deep, sloppy July humidity tangling them until times is square, as Theo used to say, though he'd never been. And so his Sinaloan destiny linked with Webb to this eastern place. And so Charlie Chastateas would dump his Theo's ashes wherever he thought best, here in times of square. Charlie looked down at his Theo's new shell, then said, Pero oye, listen, oye, and look, Theo, la luz, said Charlie to his Theo, whom he toted in black plastic sack, cinched at top end. How long? And hidden. Theo in his dreams followed clinking cloud, rolling curtains, grass, green neon, billowing crowd furrowed strange brows. Sure, mighty torrent. Sure as mighty crowd, and conmete, Pancho. Hush your thunder, said Charlie, clearly speaking his Theo. Shun what's common and mean. 6,982,488 lights flashing theory thought bulbs, and another 6,982,488 in noise, and his Theo from beyond, para tiempo to boot in these lines. Cosmos, black, blanket, star, speckled planets, nebulae, constellations of sun. Len yo orejas, that Charlie to the folks exiting planet Hollywood, and to some 50-foot tall, pouty lipped white young man or maybe woman. Oh, Theo away alone along 42, Charlie walking solo west with Theo's ashes in this sack, plastic. Watchale, walking Theo's ashes north past Swatch Hub sidewise. Oh, servicio, here, Theo. Here times money, Theo, Charlie said to his uncle's ashes. Sack cinched. Time a movement in Ethiopia. Time metaphors, said Charlie to his uncle's ashes of movement don't exist. Well, buckle no arrow, buckle no fleeing. Sense. And Charlie Chastateas reckoned here in Nueva York. Lights and folks who ask C for muddy and ask say, B to B. What's in that bag, boss? And can I get some? And see, no, es mi tío en esta bolsa. Basta. Y no forever sus Sinaloan primos no tienen su papá. Not now, no forever, Charlie. And the body just disappears, becomes dirt, dirt, dirt. Well, his ashes anyway. Never to have visited times of sweat with blood mixed with his flesh. Ho ho tío, dead, dead, dead. First blind as a bat in political matters. Racist como Ezra Pound is racist Theo, fearful Theo, hatred, hard-hearted contra women, Jews, homosexuals, Puerto Ricans. Evil Theo of different worlds really refracted big time. And he wanted times of square? No manches, he died from self-hatred, self-pity, self-dread. All these lights, Charlie looked up. Always electric day here in this place. Charlie needed a dark place, and he eyed a green flower pot, sweat in his eyes, pot over yonder, and said to the box, There are two things in this dirty, dirty world. Up he looked at groups of chaperone folks, by working class folks, Max Museum, J-Lo, second visible through the window. Two things. Brute facts and social facts, Dio. Brute facts exist without man. Charlie still speaking in the cinched bag, but objects in relation to time after lantern lard, yas of God, absence of meaning, and Charlie speaking faster. Rambling, ravelvo, space without time, repetition instead. Cyclical time, hello, Quetzalcoatl, I order universe, Times Square, stop! And nothing. Nothing. Look, Theo. Here he spoke to the ashes in the box. Shells.
Yeah.
That's it.
And where's it published on?
That book is available by Fence Books.
Fence
The
Books.
Codex
All right.
Mohadic. Yeah.
Excellent.
Good
Excellent.
times.
And do you have any upcoming projects you want everyone to know about?
Well, I'm actually working on my taco literacy book right now, so hopefully that'll be in a few years. And then I have another book of poetry that'll be out with the operating system, I believe, next year. So keep your eyes out and look for me on Twitter too. Go for it.
Operating system. So it's coming published by the operating system. The other one's published by.
That one is still in the works. I'm still working on the taco literacy book, so I'm working on the proposal and stuff right now. So that's going to be well within a little ways ahead.
Okay. Cool. All right. Well, all these things are very exciting. We'll drop the links to things that are currently available, and it's been a real honor to have you.
Yeah, man. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. It makes a bright spot for this kind of really dark time.
Oh, warm my heart. All right. Thank you, Stephen, and I'm sure we'll be talking soon.
All right, man. Take care. See you later, bud.